Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the channel where I, a real-life lawyer, examine the laws of history. Today's topic, the sex laws of ancient Rome. We will begin with incest, then pedophilia, and we will end by talking about the true crime against the empire, homosexuality. Chapter 1. Incest. It was illegal, very illegal, which I find kind of weird because both the Greek and Roman gods loved to sleep with their family members. Initially, in pagan Rome, the prohibition on incest was based on moral custom rather than written law. There would be no marriage to anyone in a person's direct bloodline, meaning parents and siblings were off limits. Relations to the fourth degree, nieces and nephews, were also off limits. It was, however, legal to marry a first cousin. But since these were moral prohibitions, generally speaking, men were advised to refrain from marrying somebody in a gray area. For example, a man would be advised not to marry his direct descendants via adoption, meaning that a man should probably not marry his stepdaughter, so on and so forth. Interestingly, the moral rules that governed incestuous relationships in pagan Rome also applied to slaves. Most laws didn't apply to slaves. Slaves were property, they weren't people, and therefore the laws could not apply to them. Take, for example, a Roman slave owner who had a daughter with one of his slaves. He could not then marry the child, because it's his biological daughter, and the Romans recognized that that was kind of weird. He would also have to refrain from any sort of relationship with the daughter's descendants. That's not to say that these rules were constant. The Roman Emperor Claudius relaxed the rules to allow him to marry his niece. The relaxed rule remained in effect for nearly 300 years, despite its weirdness, until it was reimposed by Constantius II, son of Constantine and himself a devout Christian. As an aside, the Christian Empire did bring about serious changes in how incest was viewed. It also broadened the definition. For example, in Christ's Empire, the prohibition on incest was broadened. It was extended to include a man marrying his deceased brother's widow and marriage between first cousins. But for now, we go back to the pagan empire. Despite Claudius marrying his niece, we know that it was still taboo. Take, for example, Suetonius, who wrote the 12 Caesars, which reads better as a gossip column rather than history. He writes about Caligula wanting to sleep with his sister, Nero caressing his mother's body after killing her, and the above trope about Claudius marrying his niece. He wrote it with the goal to be mind-boggling and to depict the Julians as monsters. His highlighting of the incestuous inclinations of Augustus's descendants means something to us. HBO series Rome illustrates just how awful it was when Augustus himself, then Octavian as a child, had sex with his sister and was promptly beaten to a bloody pulp by his mother. There is no indication that that actually happened, but it is kind of funny. Regarding punishments, the punishments depended on the degree of incest. Incest within the immediate family, parents, siblings, etc., was inexcusable. Both parties would be charged with incest, and it was a capital offense, meaning that it was punishable by death, or by way of another favorite Roman sentence, exile to a random island. Now, you probably haven't thought about this, but I have, because I'm a dork. In ancient Egypt, it was common for men to marry their sisters and other close relatives. The Ptolemies, including Cleopatra herself, were notorious for this, as the purpose of the inbreeding was to preserve their bloodline. Think about the Habsburgs later on in history. When the Romans came to take over Egypt, the laws caused a lot of confusion. The Roman solution was simple. Roman law applied to the Romans, and Egyptian law applied to the Egyptians. The Romans in Egypt couldn't marry their siblings, but the Egyptians in Egypt could. Back to punishments. In cases of other degrees of relationships, the punishments and who could be punished varied. It was recognized that accidents happened, and sometimes there could be confusion. For example, a man removed from his family could accidentally marry his sister's daughter. The marriage would be voided, that is nullified and made so that it never existed. There was some leeway for pardons, and in these cases, the women usually made off with no or a lesser sentence. That's not to say all was hunky-dory and people got let off without punishments. There were several aggravating and mitigating circumstances that would be considered, including whether rape or attempted seduction, debauchery, discussed later, played a role in the consummation of the incestuous relationship. Interestingly, the Roman laws did apply to quasi-family relationships, positions of trust. For example, a Roman tutor would be banned from marrying his pupil. Similar relationships between magistrates and provincials were also forbidden. And that ends our conversation on incest. Now we move on to Chapter 2, pedophilia. Most people, with the exception of Jared Fogle, will agree that pedophilia is bad. As it turns out, the Romans were like most people. The Roman laws against pedophilia are about as old as Roman written history itself. For you people out there who don't know, Rome was founded in 753 BC. In 509 it became a republic, but Roman written history didn't pick up until around 300 BC. Let me set the stage. This is a culture where people regularly got married in their early teens. It was common for 20 and 30, 40-year-old men to marry 14-year-old girls. Regularly, noble children were married to each other at rather young ages to cement political alliances. The first recorded instance of a Roman pedophile comes to us from 226 BC. The suspect was Gaius Scantinius Capitolinus, a magistrate. He was accused by one Marcus Claudius Marcellus, also a magistrate, of having propositioned his son. In other words, Gaius Scantinius, a pedophile, tried to proposition the son of his co-worker. Not a good way to ensure a positive work environment. Scantinius was charged with stupra, which could loosely be translated as debauchery. Debauchery encompassed attempted or successful seductions of freeborn Roman boys, girls, or married women. We covered the issue of married women on our video on adultery. I note that Roman relations with slaves or male prostitutes were still legal. In other words, as much as the Romans hated pedophiles, child abuse was a fact of Roman life, and there would only be punishment if the child, regardless of gender, was freeborn. Back to Scantinius and his trial. If you watched our other video on adultery, you'd be familiar with how Roman trials around the time of Augustus generally worked. The case of Scantinius was about 200 years before that. Scantinius was unlucky. There were no jury trials. Instead, you would be tried by the entire People's Assembly, called the Comita. Remember what I said about most people disliking pedophiles? The People's Assembly wasn't just made up of most people. It was literally all of the people, assuming you were a freeborn male. However, Scantinius was an elected magistrate, meaning that his trial would take place before the Senate. In fact, Scantinius tried to leverage his power and convince the senators to get him off of the charges. The senators looked at him, called him a scumbag, and put his case down for trial. The trial went as follows. To this boy, Scantinius, colleague of Marcellus, a bold and licentious man, made overtures of love. The boy at first repelled the attempt by himself, but when it was made again, told his father. Marcellus, highly indignant, denounced the man in the Senate. The culprit devised many exceptions and ways of escape, appealing to the tribunes of the people, and when these rejected his appeal, he sought to escape the charge by denying it. There had been no witness of his proposals, and therefore the Senate decided to summon the boy before them. When he appeared and they beheld his blushes, tears, and shame mingled with quenchless indignation, they wanted no further proof, but condemned Scantinius and set a fine upon him. With this money, Marcellus had silver libation bowls made and dedicated them to the gods. Sometime after this, the so-called Lex Scantinina was passed, named for Mr. Gaius Scantinius himself. The law is lost to us, and its parameters, including punishments, are unknown. Based on the case of Scantinius himself, however, we can infer that the punishment for attempted seduction was a fine. That was for the attempt. Succeeding in the seduction or rape appears to have been a capital offense, resulting in condemnation to death or life imprisonment. Take, for example, the case of Cornelius, a veteran centurion who was charged with having taken the innocence of a young boy. Pescennius, triumvir for capital punishments, publicly imprisoned Cornelius, a most noted soldier who had been 4 times advanced to be a centurion of the first rank because he had intimate familiarity with a youth born of free parents. Cornelius appealed against this to the tribunes, but when he said nothing of the facts, but only that he was ready to put in bail and alleged that the boy had openly made a public prostitution of his body for money, that they absolutely refused to pay any attention to the matter. As a result, Cornelius died in prison. Aside from those examples, the Lex Scantinina appears to have been largely ignored, and we're not entirely sure why. Augustus's laws more or less skirt around it. The logical explanation would be that pedophilia was rampant within the Roman Empire. For example, Augustus' successor, Tiberius, was infamous for the school of minnows, children who he had trained to nibble on him and swim between his thighs. Nero, another Julian descendant and sex-crazed maniac, killed his second wife but located a teenage boy who kind of looked like her. He had that boy castrated and later married him. Admittedly, these are extreme examples, but there should be some more rational explanations as to why the law fell out of use. Caelius, a contemporary of Cicero living around the time of Julius Caesar, wrote that the lex scantinina was used as a political weapon amongst the Roman nobles. Caelius himself was indicted under the lex scantinina, being charged with pedophilia during a political feud. He charged his rival with doing the same. The charge and countercharge ultimately came to nothing, as the mutual accusations boiled down to mere finger-pointing. That said, I have a different theory as to why it fell out of use. Not all Roman justice was done through the courts. There was still plenty of room for what we call self-help. Take, for example, the case of Leon Gary Plausch, who in 1984 killed a child molester who had kidnapped his son. The child molester had been previously arrested and was being transported home to face trial. Gary Plausch donned a disguise and met his son's abuser at the airport armed with a .38 caliber revolver. As the child molester walked through the airport, and with news cameras rolling, Gary Plausch fired a single bullet on live television into his son's abuser's head. This extrajudicial killing ignited debates all across the United States. In Roman times, there was no reason for debate. It was encouraged. A gentleman named Valerius Maximus wrote a column called On Chastity, which recorded several similar instances of self-help. Some examples are as follows. Gaius Marius in 105 BC, yes, that Gaius Marius, found that his sister's son, his nephew, a military tribune, was legally killed by a common soldier because Gaius' nephew had tried to defile him. Other examples include Sempronius Musca, who caused Gallius to be whipped for being caught in the act of adultery. Another man named Carbo Antoninus was castrated by Vibenius. Another, Pontius, was castrated in a separate instance. My favorite is Furius Bacchus, who was caught in the act and was handed over to the victim's household slaves to be violated. None of these men were punished for exacting their own revenge. Despite all of this, please keep in mind that slave boys and prostitutes were still in bounds. Some emperors tried to legislate against that. For example, the Roman Emperor Domitian made it illegal to castrate boys with a special eye towards the fact that castrated boys frequently ended up working in brothels. Nerva, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius continued the ban. Punishments also evolved. You'll recall that Scantininus was issued a fine for attempted seduction. Later during the empire, the punishment for attempted rape was seizure of half of the criminal's assets and forfeiture of legal standing. Rape itself, as it always has been, was still a capital crime. That temporarily ends our conversation on pedophilia. We will return to it shortly. We must now move on to the issue of homosexuality and its illegality in the Christian Empire. I must again set the stage. In the pagan empire, same-sex acts were allowed in Rome. We know that several notable Romans took male lovers in the Greek image. Nobody cared about female homosexuality. There were only two punishable acts that could be perpetrated by a Roman male. As discussed earlier, one of them was the rape, attempted rape, or seduction of a freeborn child. The other was a man willingly taking a passive role in sex with another man. Passive conduct would make the offending man liable for forfeiture of half of his money and loss of all legal status. Later on in the Christian Empire, he would be condemned to death. As a quick aside, even though these men were said to behave as women, there was no societal concept of sexual identity or sexual orientation. These laws against passive-acting men policed habitual offenders for their actions rather than what we would consider today discrimination on the basis of sexual identity. It simply was not a thing. Otherwise, stated earlier, homosexuality was allowed. The Christian Empire turned that completely on its head. For those of you unfamiliar, Christianity started off as a weird branch of Judaism, which means many of the early Christians followed Jewish laws set forth in the Torah. Homosexuality under Jewish religious laws was a no-no, and I'm pretty sure it still is. Several passages in Leviticus refer to same-sex marriage as an abhorrence and call for the death of the offending persons. In the Christian Bible, the New Testament books of Romans, written by the Apostle Paul sometime around 58 AD, again called it unnatural and a sin. The sin was forgivable, but it was still a sin. Now, the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. His sons took over the empire after his death. At that time, Christianity was not the official religion of the empire, although it was the religion of the emperor. Constantine simply legalized it. One of his sons during this period, Constantius, issued a law essentially calling for the death of all homosexuals. Christianity wouldn't become the official religion of the empire until 380 AD under Emperor Theodosius. From that point on, pedophilia of young boys and homosexuality were treated as one in the same. Any same-sex act with anybody, regardless of age, was punishable by death. For example, any man who played a passive or feminine role, regardless of whatever, would be publicly burned by 390 AD. It is kind of funny that although the Christian laws had a Jewish origin, the Christian emperors also banned heterosexual marriage between any Christians and Jews. The laws continue to evolve. If you watched our other video on adultery, you would be familiar with Augustus's Lex Julia Adulteratus. That law mainly applied to women who had affairs with strange men. The laws set forth several punishments, including banishment for the offending parties. You may already be familiar with another law code, that of Justinian the Great. In his law code, he re-envisioned the Lex Julia with a new Christian lens, remarking that it would henceforth apply to same-sex relations. He took the old pagan law against adultery and said it now applied to all extramarital affairs, including homosexual relationships, which I think is a pretty cool example of religious law and civil law meshing. He further remarked that engaging in same-sex relations was a choice, and that men should choose not to, as it was sinful and a natural disaster. These Christian laws would remain in force for the remainder of the Roman Empire until 1453 AD. And with that, our discussion of the Roman sex laws comes to an end. I will be doing a separate video on prostitution just because everybody loves prostitution. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in again to learn more about the laws of history.